Ms. Furlong, the border officers at the CBSA voted last week in favor of strike action due to the lack of a contract for the last 2 years. Their demands include wage parity, protection from management retaliation, access to telework, and protections from CBSA's obsessive reliance on contracting out. How concerned are you and the businesses that you represent that this border disruption will cause a massive impact on Canadian business?
Thank you so much for the question. It's much appreciated. While I cannot comment on the specific labor negotiations of this union, we saw the huge impact our West Coast port strikes had to the economy as a whole last year. It was measured in the billions of dollars. CBSA is absolutely critical to the movement of goods and people across the border and into our ports. It is unfathomable that we would see another shutdown within a short period of time. And I think this committee knows how critical it is that Canada regain its reputation as a reliable trading partner.
Very well said. My next question was going to be, what would be the impact on Canada's economy if this was to occur? You did mention about the previous incident, the damage being in the billions. Would you like to make any further comment as to the impact on Canada's economy were this to occur?
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I don't have an estimate right now as to the full impact on the economy. I would be happy to do some research and provide that following the meeting.
That would be very much appreciated, Ms. Furlong. Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, one doesn't have to look deeply into recent headlines to see that Canada's economic conditions are declining and consequently eroding the prosperity and living standards of Canadians. Between 2009 and 2018, the number of regulations in Canada grew from 66,000 to 72,000. These regulations, of course, restrict business activity, impose costs on firms, and reduce economic productivity. According to a recent red tape study published by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the cost of regulation from all three levels of government to Canadian businesses totaled $38.8 billion in 2020 for a total of 731 million hours, the equivalent of nearly 375,000 full-time jobs. If we apply a $16.65 per hour cost, the federal minimum wage in Canada for 2023, $12.2 billion annually is lost to regulatory compliance. And of course, as our witnesses know here today, Canada's smallest businesses bear a proportionately high burden of the cost, paying up to 5 times more for regulatory compliance per employee than larger businesses. The smallest businesses pay $7,223 per employee annually to comply with government regulation, while larger businesses pay a much lower $1,237 per employee for regulatory compliance. Certainly not small numbers, Mr. Chair. So, Monsieur Girard, although federal departments and agencies are meant to annually report the regulatory burden they impose on Canadians, this is not legislated and is extremely difficult to access. Why do you think the government is trying to hide this information from Canadians, unlike many of its other provincial counterparts?
Well, I'm not. I think I'm not able to answer that question directly in terms of the regulatory costs. I think there is a need to understand a lot better how we frame compliance, both through standards and regulations, and what are the impacts of creating new regulations. And I don't see a lot of reports on outcomes. That would be my interest, is figuring out what are the expectations we have in terms of laws when we pass new laws, and how do we measure whether we're getting there. I'm not seeing that, unfortunately. So we're focusing on the process. We're not really focusing on the outcomes.
That's
right.
A Liberal government for you.
The federal government has a one-for-one rule building its regulatory framework, which means for every new regulatory cost, as outlined by another witness, it must be offset by an equal or greater reduction. Has this government been following through on this commitment, would you say?
Well, given what you just mentioned before, I'm assuming no. And I think that the track that I'm proposing in the paper would help reduce the regulatory burden. If we took a hard look at compliance to laws through standards as opposed to regulations, and standards are designed, co-designed by industry and academics and regulators, you'd probably be able to find a way to reduce the regulatory burden while keeping Canadians safe. That would be my sense. That taking a look at standards as opposed to full-fledged regulations would keep Canadians safe, but would reduce the burden on industry.
Correct. Because as I mentioned, the cost of regulation, according to the CFIB, was $38.8 billion in 2020 and took a total of $731 million. Can you comment further on how much of Canada's business would be improved by removing the billions in dollars of costs in regulation?
Actually, I have to interrupt because that is our time.
Thank
Perhaps
you.
we can save
Thank
it
you very
for
much, Mr.